So let's dive in. We're going to take a look at grant suspensions today. So at a very high level, we need to talk about what a grant is and what a suspended grant is. So a grant simply reserves a portion of the CBRS spectrum for use by a CBSD. A suspended grant means that the CBSD can't begin to or has to stop its transmissions. Now, that doesn't mean a suspended grant is useless, and we'll get to why that is later. The reasons a grant can be suspended, first, when can you see a suspended grant? When you deploy a new CBSD and you're turning it on for the first time, it could see a suspended grant. If you have an existing CBSD requesting a new grant, or if a DPA gets activated. So those are the three times you might see a suspended grant. Now, the reasons for suspension. There are 6. Some are more frequent than others. The first is what we call a whisper zone, and that's the area that surrounds and protects an ESC and prevents devices from interfering with that ESC. Also, if you're near a GWPC, a grandfathered wireless protection zone, and you're asking for too much power near that GWPC, you also will conceivably have your grant suspended. The DPA neighborhoods are the areas inland around the DPAs of course being over the ocean. The DPA neighborhoods, if you're in one of those, you might be suspended on day 1 if the DPA gets activated. The fourth reason is if the ESC is not active, for some reason the ESC has gone offline. We obviously try to avoid that, but that would require, could conceivably require a suspension of a grant near that ESC or near the DPA that's served by that ESC. The fifth reason is if an ESC is active, it's functioning normally, but that DPA gets activated. That can happen anytime. And the last and somewhat trivial reason that you could have a grant suspended is if you're near the Miami FSS. So let's take a look at each of these things. If you're near an ESC location, and I'm going to think of this today as if you're turning on your CBSD for the first time. So it's a new device. It could, as we talked about, it could also be an existing device. But in this case, we're talking about a new device. You power it up and you just happen to be near an ESC. And we call that the ESC's whisper zone. If you're closer to that, the closer you are to that ESC, the less power you're going to be allowed on day 1. You'll be allowed more power on day 2. Now, let's hang on a second, because you're probably saying, what is this day 1 and day 2 stuff? This brings up the important concept of CPAS. And CPAS is when the SAS in the middle of the night calculates with all the other SASs what the total number of devices are and how much interference can be caused. After that has happened, we're in what's called day 2. So day 1, when I say day 1, I'm talking about before CPAS has happened. When I'm talking about day 2, I'm talking about after that CPAS has happened and the SAS has done more advanced interference calculations. So that means on day 1, you might get a different power when you're at that latitude and longitude than you would on day 2. Normally what happens is on day 2, the SAS calculates more precisely the amount of power that's available and then raises the amount of power that's available to the device. So in this case, here's what would happen. On day 1, the SAS would show EAP pending. IAP pending. And what that means is that it has to still go through CPAS to calculate the power that's available. So the grant would be suspended until day 2, at which point the power would be reevaluated and that grant might be unsuspended. So there's a couple of ways to deal with this. If you want to know what the maximum power it is you can get from day 1, in other words, I want my device to turn on and start transmitting right away, here's how you avoid the suspension: do a spectrum inquiry. That will tell you how much power is available on day 1. Now, if on the other hand, you want to get the most amount of power that's available to you, then we have a tool for that. It's called the spectrum availability bar. And that lets you see which channels have how much power restrictions for your device. So this will give you your day 2 power, or pretty close to it. The day 1 power, you need to do a spectrum inquiry. The day 2 power, you can use the spectrum availability. And let's see how that works. I'm flipping here into the Google SAS portal. And you all have access to this if you're a SAS customer. And your devices will show up in your SAS portal. And we have a lot of, you may have your own way of viewing your devices in the field, your production environment, as you might call it. But we've given you this tool called the SAS portal, and it's a great tool. If you haven't tried it, you should check it out. It lets you do a lot of things in terms of not only just visualizing your devices, but controlling them. So we're talking here about whisper zones. Okay, we've put a device here in Myrtle Beach, and I'm zooming in to that device. And I'm using what's called the spectrum availability overlay. It's over here on the left-hand side of the screen. If you click on this view overlays, it lets you choose Cat A or Cat B overlay. And I've turned that on already. You can click again and turn it off. But now when I click it on, I see that I've got this shadow around where I happen to want to put my device here in Myrtle Beach. And it's saying that the number of channels that's available is limited. So because I've got this shading, it's not bright green. So I know there's some limitations here. And here's my device. You'll see it's orange, which means it has a suspended grant. That's because I set this up ahead of time. When I click on the device, I get information on the right-hand side about that device in the SAS portal. The first thing I see is just the name of the site, as we call them, because you can have more than one CBSD at a particular latitude and longitude. So the latitude and longitude is the site, the device is here. Click on the device, and it shows me this whisper zone device that I set up to show the this whisper zone trial. Now, if I click on the status bar here, you'll see the grants that are associated with this device. And when I look at this particular first grant for 3550 to 3555, it's a 5 megahertz grant, and it says IAP pending. Here it is. We tell you the suspension suspension reason right here in the user interface. We also tell you the move lists. We'll get to that in a minute. That has to do with DPAs. But the important thing here is that we've got a device. It's IAP pending. I'm using my spectrum availability overlap here, and I'm taking a look at what might be going on here. How can I get this device unsuspended? What are the tools that I have to make this device work? Okay, so we've turned on the device. It's gotten IAP pending, even though I did my best to determine what the power would be for this device. How did I do that? When you click anywhere in the tool, when you have this, and the spectrum availability helps you do it, but when you click in the tool and you get one of these place marks, it then shows you the spectrum availability for that spot on the right-hand side. And if I click over here near this device, I can see that I have partial power available. This is a Cat A device, by the way. So I see I have partial power available, and it's a little finicky because I have to click right near the device. But I requested a 10 dB power for this device. And here I've got, at this point, it says 9 dB is the partial power, the maximum power I could get for this device. If I click a little closer, let me zoom way in here. If I click a little closer, well, it says 6 now. Before I had done a spectrum inquiry and I got 10 dBm per megahertz. So if I wanted to be extra safe, I would request 6 dBm per megahertz. But here's the important thing here. I remember we talked about it before. The only way to tell your day 1 power is with spectrum inquiry. This here is your day 2 power. This is your after IAP power. This is what you can get. This is the maximum you can get with that device if it is configured in a certain way. Now, for this specific device, when I click on that device, I get even a more accurate reading of that. Here, in the when I've clicked on the device, in the config tab, it shows me the maximum power I can get, 8 dBm per megahertz. So if I wanted to maximize my power here, I would choose 8 dBm per megahertz for day 2 power. For day 1 power, I don't know what that is. I'd have to do a spectrum inquiry with the device, and that happens on the device itself. So if your device has the availability, has the tool with which you can do SI spectrum inquiry, then you do the spectrum inquiry, and it will tell you what you can get on day 1. This is what you can get on day 2. And that's because there's an ESC right here in Myrtle Beach. And that's why the power is limited. But if I've turned on the device and it's gotten suspended, I now have two ways of dealing with that. The first is do a spectrum inquiry if I want that device to go on right away. The spectrum inquiry will tell me what the maximum power I can get right now. The SAS portal, our user interface here, is telling me that in this location, the maximum I can ask for is 8 dBm per megahertz. So if I request that, that will be my day 2 power. Day 1, I'll be suspended. But day 2, after midnight or after around midnight, that grant will be unsuspended and I'll be able to use a higher power. This is a Cat A device, so it may not seem like a lot of power. For Cat B devices, it can mean the difference between 50 milliwatts and say 3-4 watts. So that day 2 power can be a significant increase, which is why sometimes it's worth waiting for that suspended grant. And as I said at the beginning, suspended grants have some value because on day 2, in this case, I would get more power for this grant. So if you're near a GWPC, your power will be limited, just like if you're near the ESC. And just like near the ESC, you'll get more power on day 2 after the SAS has done its calculations. Just like with the ESC, if you want to know what's allowed on day 1, do a spectrum inquiry. Here's an important note, though. With GWPZs, the suspended grant can be terminated after CPAS if the power is too high. So here's what happens on day 2 if you've been greedy, or if your device has been greedy. If you've asked for too much power, it does the CPAS, and then after midnight, it determines that your suspended grant is not going to get approved. It will terminate that grant. And most likely, it will suggest the power to the device, and the device will automatically then be able to request a grant for the appropriate amount of power. So just to make sure that you're all aware, just because a grant is suspended doesn't mean it's actually going to be approved after CPAS. Normally it will. But in some cases, if it's asked for too much power after CPAS, that grant will just be terminated because the SAS has determined unequivocally there's too much, it's asking for too much power there. So let's go back into the SAS portal and take a look at how this works. In this case, we're going up to Columbus, Ohio, where there happen to be a couple of GWPZs. And here's our device. This is a Cat B device. And I'm going to purposely make a mistake here because you might say, wait a minute, I've got this overlay here where I'm seeing the colors of the number of channels available in my map. And it's bright green. How come? Why is my device being suspended? I've made a mistake on purpose. Look over here on the left. We're still looking at the spectrum availability for Cat A devices. If I flip to Cat B, it loads that layer, and we see, yep, sure enough, this Cat B device is in an area where it's going to have some limitations due to GWPC. This is very similar to what we did before, so it may sound a little repetitive, but let me go through it again. This is with a Cat B device now. So I've got this device. It's suspended. I can tell that because the color is orange. I have to try to figure out what can I do to get this device working. What's the situation here? I know that I'm near a GWPZ and I've got some limitations. If I click on the device, the SAS portal is going to give me some calculations here. It's doing some calculations to tell me what the spectrum availability is. And yes, it can take up to 3 minutes. Sometimes it's faster. In this case, the restrictions are here in the upper part of the band, where my power is limited, particularly up here at the top upper channels. And the power is limited to 12 dBm. Here it says. So again, this is my day 2 power. This is my after CPAS power. If I wanted to know how to get this device active right now, I do a spectrum inquiry and use that to determine what the power is that I can use. Meanwhile, I want to use, I'm a savvy tech operator on CBRS, and I want to maximize my amount of coverage here. I want to maximize my power output. So, but I still need to use this upper channel for some reason in this example. And I'm mousing over this upper channel and I see my power is 12 dBm per megahertz. Well, let's click on the status tab over here and look at the grant that's suspended, because my grants are shown in the status tab. And you can see I've got this grant for the uppermost 5 megahertz of the channel. And I asked for 19 dBm per megahertz. So that's why my grant is suspended. My device asked for 19 dBm and I'm just not allowed it. Certainly not on day 1. So what should I ask for? I go back to the config tab. I mouse over here and I see that in the upper channel, I'm allowed 12 dBm per megahertz. So I should request this grant for 12 dBm per megahertz if I want to be allowed power on day 2. So Google SAS gives you the tools to figure out how to get around a suspension when you're in a GWPZ or near an ESC, as we talked about first. The first tool, obviously, spectrum inquiry. The second tool is this spectrum availability within the SAS portal that tells you how much power you can expect on day 2. Okay, slides. There's a couple of other ways that your grant can be suspended. So let's talk about those to make sure you're prepared for those too. If you happen to be operating near Chicago, or maybe downtown New York City, in areas that are particularly complicated with a lot of GWPZs and things to calculate. Some cities, I think in like Houston, maybe I think has a bunch of GWPZs. If you're managing a large fleet, sometimes the SAS takes extra time to calculate the interference, even on day 1. And what you'll see is the IAP pending message. That will go away after a couple of heartbeats. So if you're in a downtown area that might be complicated, give the device a few heartbeats to catch up. There's nothing you can do here except just wait a few minutes, and the device should, at that point, be able to get its authorization from the SAS. Again, that's not a very common scenario, but this is a deep dive. All right, we're getting nerdy here. We're checking out all the possible reasons that your device could be suspended, so you know about all of them. This is the trivial one I talked about before. If you're operating in Miami as well, the FSS in Miami operates like a GWPZ. The closer you are to the FSS, the less power is available. You can get more power on day 2. If you want to get it online right away, do a spectrum inquiry. So this is a little bit of a different message. If you're operating near the coast and a DPA channel is activated, the SAS will suspend the grant. If you're trying to get a grant with a new device, you will also get suspended. You won't know why. It won't, it'll happen from the beginning, from day 1. Here's what happens. Again, we're talking about a DPA that's been activated here. If there's no aircraft carriers around, then the DPA will be clear and you won't have this problem. I don't want you to think that if you're near a DPA, you're going to get suspended all the time. That's not necessarily the case. Certain DPAs are more active than others. What we're talking about here is we're taking a deep dive into suspensions. We're talking about what happens if you get suspended, and it's because of a DPA. And here's how that works. On day 1, if your device is located, your new device, the new grant, is located anywhere in the DPA's neighborhood, and that DPA is activated, then that will suspend the entire DPA neighborhood because the CBSD could cause interference. So your device just being located within, I think it's 250 kilometers. It varies from coast to coast and DPA to DPA, but you could be a significant ways away from the coast. But on day 1, you're inside that neighborhood, that DPA neighborhood, somewhere within a couple 100 miles of the coast, let's say. If that DPA is activated, that's called the move list, and it affects the entire DPA neighborhood. And so your device would be suspended. And here we're getting into the day 1 and day 2 thing again, because on day 2, the SAS does the calculations overnight, and that neighborhood up here changes to the impact zone. The neighborhood is a huge area at a fixed distance from the DPA. The impact zone is much smaller. The impact zone is refined every night, and after CPAS happens in the middle of the night, the only reason your device will be suspended is if it's in the impact zone. The impact zone is much closer to the coast. So if your device is in the impact zone and the DPA is activated on day 2, you will get a suspension. All of the information about grant suspensions is mentioned in our help center rather. We've made multiple updates to explain all of these features. Do a Google search for Google CBRS Help or Google SAS Help. If you have questions during the week, you can send them by email, sas-support@google.com. And of course, if you have questions that you want to ask live, you can do that here at the SAS office hours.